Bottomline Africa. We now want to have today's discussion centered on the latest uproar in terms of human rights, and Amnesty International in this regard has just released a report touching on the state of human rights in Tanzania ever since President John Pombe Magufuli got to power in 2015. There have been a couple of instances where human rights have actually been breached upon. Talk about censorship, repression, and fear spread across the opposition party, opposition leaders, the freedom of the press, which has also been trampled upon. So just to get a little bit more of what's happening, not just in Tanzania, but Burundi as well, keen to know these two countries have elections coming up in 2020. That's the general elections. So this plays a big part in terms of, filming what goes out into the public. Now, joining me in studio, I'll start with my immediate left, Roland Ebola, who's Amnesty International researcher for Tanzania. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and on the far left, Rachel Nicholson, who's the Amnesty International researcher for Burundi. Thank you so much for making time. All right, now let's kickstart with the latest in Tanzania since that report is just released. Highlighting President John Magufuli getting to power in 2015. There have been a couple of implemented new laws that seem to be oppressive, curtailing citizens' rights and freedoms. Tell us a little bit more about the report that has just been released.
So Amnesty International launched or released a report yesterday, and it was more of a joint release with Human Rights Watch. After doing our research separately, different dates, the researchers for Human Rights Watch and ourselves realized that there was a lot in common. And one thing that we found out from our research that dated from November last year to September this year, with in-country mission in Tanzania between February and March, was that one, there is a lot of repression, and the repression targeted not just by laws, but others targeted to independent groups after pronouncement by President John Magufuli, whereby Magufuli would say, would pronounce something and it become laws. A law, for instance, in 2016, President Magufuli made a pronouncement on blanket ban on all political activities in Tanzania, and that has been implemented, and we have documented 11 politicians from the opposition who have been arrested over time, and their cases are still in court with regards to the peacefully assembling. Apart from that, media houses have been banned or suspended for reasons of publishing false information, and this has resulted from a newly enacted, 2015 enacted Media Services Act. Bloggers are not free to blog, and they have been arrested and charged with false information as well, resulting from online content regulation that also was enacted during President Magufuli's reign. We also have other laws such as Cybercrime Act that with online content regulation have also come up with so many other requirements, like cyber cafes have to have CCTV cameras, owners of blogs have to give details, information about the identity of contributors to their blogs, and so many other things that have actually happened that I think we will continue discussing as we go on in this program.
Definitely, we'll get to the nitty-gritty details, but let's just hear what is transpiring in Burundi in terms of human rights. We well know of the clamor, the negative clamor around the constitutional referendum, trying to push Pierre Nkurunziza to potentially remain in power till 2034. Is this a certain avenue where opposition leaders are actually being targeted in regards to this? The freedom of press, what is the state in Burundi?
Unfortunately, the picture in Burundi since 2015, since the start of the crisis around Nkurunziza's attempt to stand for a third term in power and the protest against that, is very similar to what we've been seeing in Tanzania. We've seen a continued clampdown on opposition politicians, on freedom of expression, on human rights defenders, on the media. So, as you rightly noted, there was a referendum in 2018. Following that referendum, Nkurunziza actually said that he won't stand again in 2020. We're waiting to hear who the ruling party is going to put forward as their candidate. But yes, opposition leaders have faced numerous violations of their human rights in the past few months. The main opposition party, the CNL, many of their members have been arrested, some have even been killed. There's a pattern of destroying their party offices in local areas. So the situation going into 2020 is very tense. And one incident that happened a week ago now that's very concerning was the arrest of 4 journalists from the independent private newspaper Iwachu and their driver. It's one of the last remaining private media houses operating in Burundi on the ground. Many others are operating from exile and doing a great job, but these guys are on the ground. They're following up in person. They're doing, serious reporting of what's happening, and that's what they're being penalised now for. That's why they were arrested, essentially, last week.
All right. So it seems like state-owned media companies seem to be thriving, while independent, free-minded companies seem to be targeted by the government. But let's cross over to Tanzania right now. The 2015 Statistics Act denies citizens alternative sources of independently verified information. We have the Electronic and Postal Communications Regulations. Anyone with a blog and website should pay hefty license fees. These are just to name a few. So highlighting the oppressive laws, it seems they're meant to target critics of the regime, and I think that was highlighted in your report, right?
Yes, that was highlighted in our report, targeting critics in the sense that, one, the people that we've documented that have been arrested and charged using these laws, especially the ones you've mentioned, cybercrime especially, you find these are opposition members or journalists or student leaders that have either been linked with the opposition party, and especially Chama cha Demokrasia, that is Chadema. In fact, in one appalling incident, we had student leader Bob Chacha Wangwe, who was charged in court and fined and jailed for a statement that he had not even sent. So it is actually a draft statement. So the Tanzania Communication Regulatory Authority obtained his communication gadget, the phone, and using that, they were able to sustain a charge, and and the court really found him guilty. Of course, this was later on set aside by the High Court, which shows that to some extent there's some cause at work. But yes, the target has been the dissenting voices and people that freely speak their minds. Apart from bloggers, you mentioned about statistics, whereby the Statistics Act of 2015 had criminalized publishing information that is not verified by, the authorities, the Tanzania National Bureau of Statistics.
Right.
I know that there were amendments earlier this year, but even with the amendments that were highly pushed by the World Bank, meaning that pressure can be put into government authorities to actually, revise their laws for the better, there is still an aspect whereby the government can still compel anybody that that brings out statistics to retract or make an apology on national dailies about any data or finding that is inaccurate to government.
To the government.
So they are the holders of truth, and you are not supposed to really find any alternative truth anywhere else.
I'm sure the case is similar in Burundi, but with these laws, are they impeding journalism? Are there fears of journalism disintegrating into mere propaganda based on, praising the ruling party and actually throwing dirt or dust towards the opposition parties who are, saying against what the government wants?
In Burundi?
Yes.
In Burundi. So in Burundi, the challenge has been the practice of government over the last few years. So At the time of the crisis in 2015, independent media houses, actually their offices, their property was destroyed. Many had to flee the country because of threats to their life. One case that I think really highlights the climate that people are working in is that of Jean Bigirimana, who was a journalist working also with Iwachu newspaper, the same newspaper that's been targeted this week, who went missing. He was called for a meeting. He was believed to have been taken by members of the intelligence services. That was over 3 years ago. We don't know where he is. So that, I think, highlights some of the threats that we've seen. In terms of presenting the picture that the government would like to see, that the ruling party would like to see, it's been very interesting to see how information is being controlled. So, for example, there was a UN Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. They've been declared persona non grata. The government has completely refused to cooperate, answer any of their questions, give their side of the story. They've closed down the UN Human Rights Office in the country. BBC had its operating license permanently revoked earlier this year. VOA is suspended. It goes on and on to show how the government is trying to, as you say, control that information space, control the image of the country, of what's going on in the country. And I'm sure that this latest arrest of the journalists feeds into that same pattern of controlling the information that gets out about what was actually quite a serious attack, clashes between government forces and an armed group in the west of the country earlier that day. It all fits into this pattern of trying to control the information that gets out there.
Yeah, now clamping of independent media doesn't seem to be a new thing in Tanzania. We well know of the much hyped Erika Bendera, the Tanzanian journalist, who has gone through a whirlwind of charges. Critics believing those charges have been trumped up against him, seen as crackdown on the press. But in terms of the elections coming up in 2020, do you think this might be a motive in terms of the government clamping down on information? And what exactly needs to be done to ensure that going into 2020 in the elections, that citizens are a little bit more informed, even though there seems to be a clampdown, as she said, information? Yeah.
I think I wouldn't speak as to why the government is really doing what it's doing, but one thing that I know is that there is fear. There is fear. Whatever has been happening in Tanzania has really sent a chilling effect. You may recall the disappearance of Azori Gwanda almost 2 years ago. Azori Gwanda, a journalist, disappeared while doing his work in Pwani region of Tanzania, that is a coastal region in Tanzania, where he was reporting cases where security forces and civilians were killed. But it is strange that this case has not been fully investigated or any report made known public. 1 month ago, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Tanzania was speaking to BBC, where he said that Azori Gwanda might have died in the course of his work, something that really sent even more chills. He later retracted, but again, these are questions that need to be asked. Where is Azori Gwanda? What has been done to investigate and really come to a conclusion about his case? Erika Bendera, you mentioned about him. Erika Bendera was arrested in July, and within a span of 1 week, the police had said that they were holding him over his question about his nationality, then later on questioned him about seditious charges, then later on now charge him with offenses under the Organized Crimes Act of 1984. And Kabendera is still in jail up to now. For the last few weeks, the prosecution has been asking for more time to complete investigation. You wonder, are these trumped up charges? Why would the government arrest somebody for another reason, choose to charge him for another reason, and also, have this kind of delay tactics, to keep on holding him? So the next elections in 2020 will happen in an environment whereby, media will be afraid of speaking. politicians, I've mentioned opposition politicians that have been arrested, that are going through so many cases. Bloggers, Maxence Melo and Nike Williams, have been in court over 120 times. That is judicial harassment. 120 times just attending to their, going to a hearing. If that is the environment that is going to be there during the elections next year, then we see that people may not really participate in a climate where they are freely engaging in the political processes.
And that's definitely wrong. Nicholson, I mean, there's rule of law, both in Burundi, Tanzania, whichever country. Justice systems are there, but they seem to have been weakened. In terms of solving this problem as it lies right now, what best would be the approach of the concerned parties in terms of, and not just the international media, not just the local media as well, but all-rounded approach? What do you think would best be suited to solve these issues? Because the rule of law is there.
Thanks for raising that. That's absolutely essential. The rule of law is there, yes, but as you said, the justice system has been weakened over the years. The most important thing, we think, for resolving this, we see that Burundi is still in a human rights crisis even since 2015, and the way to resolve that crisis is to end impunity for serious human rights violations. So, what does that mean in practice? It means suspending, arresting those members of security forces who are suspected of being involved in killings, disappearances, torture, and other serious violations of human rights. It's about doing serious, independent, impartial investigations. And when there is enough evidence to show, it's important that we have enough evidence that people aren't put up as scapegoats. But when there is enough evidence, then those individuals and those who are responsible, maybe those who've also ordered certain actions to be taken, they should be held accountable in fair trials in the courts of law.
All right.
And
your closing views as we just conclude the show in terms of what's happening in Tanzania and perhaps the route to be taken.
I think if we make recommendations, and we've made recommendations, is that one, Tanzania must immediately and unconditionally release Erika Bendera and all those others that are held over politically motivated charges, trumped-up charges, and those that are in court or have processes that are also politically motivated, those cases really must be dropped. We're also urging, the government of Tanzania to revise all the repressive laws that you've mentioned. We've mentioned them by name. We're also asking, the president and government authorities that are in place of authority to stop making the rhetorics that really undermine human rights, and of course to respect decisions of the court, both its national courts and the East African Court of Justice, because in our report we documented 3 cases that the government has refused to comply with from the East African Court of Justice, which sets a very bad precedent in the region. And I think every other country or citizens of these other countries should really be concerned when one of the countries really defies as in a treaty that really establishes the East African community that we have said that we want to comply with, and we would want to have a system, an African system, a regional system that we would have more trust in.
All right, we'll definitely keep this conversation ongoing even as we highlight the state of human rights in African countries. Specifically this time around, we're focusing on Tanzania. Many thanks, Roland Ebole, for your contribution, and Rachel Nicholson on your contribution focusing on Burundi. That marks the end of today's